recorded.
Okay, welcome to day one of Contravirus School. This is Auto Shop. Today we're talking about steering and suspension. For some of you this is a review, for some of you this is brand new material you haven't heard before. Steering and suspension is what allows us to steer the car and allows us to be separated from the road so we don't feel every bump in the road. The biggest part of steering and suspension is the part that absorbs the shock of the road, and oddly enough it's not the shock absorber, it is the spring. This diagram here shows a coil spring. There are two other types of spring, a leaf spring, which is a long skinny leaves of metal stacked on each other, I'll show you one in a minute, or a torsion bar, which acts as a spring by twisting. Doesn't matter which kind of spring you have, their whole mission in life is to return to its original shape. So on a coil spring, if it squishes down when you go over a bump, it will come back to its original shape after the bump. There's two types of steering systems in cars. There's Mcpherson Strut with rack and pinion steering. Rack and pinion steering is a long skinny steering gear right here. Steering wheel is attached to that shaft. As you turn the wheel, the steering gear shifts side to side like this. And as it shifts over, it turns that wheel this side and pulls the other wheel this way. It's connected to the wheels with tie rod ends. These would be the tie rod ends between the rack and pinion steering and the wheels. The Mcpherson Strut suspension is right here. It's basically a shock absorber in the middle with a spring wrapped around the outside of it, and it acts as a whole assembly. Down here on the suspension is a control arm. The control arm controls the wheel so it will remain going straight ahead and not turn, and when it goes over a bump it's still going straight ahead. So this control arm will go up and down like this as the wheel goes over a bump. At the end of the control arm we have a ball joint. The ball joint allows the wheel to pivot like this, side to side, when you are steering the car, and it also allows the control arm to pivot at the end so the suspension can go up and down. What else? We have something called a sway bar here, or an anti-roll bar. It connects one side of the suspension to the other side of the suspension. That way when you're going around a corner hard, your car doesn't lean way to one side because the sway bar pushes up on both sides equally. The other type of suspension system, we'll scroll down a little bit, is right here. This is kind of the old school steering system with a two control arm suspension system. The old steering system has a steering gear, a big steering box right here, a pitman arm that takes the power from that steering box to move things. It moves a center link, which moves tie rods, which are connected to the wheels here. So as you turn the steering wheel on this pitman arm swings back and forth and moves those tie rods and makes the car steer back and forth. Also, the things in common, it still has a sway bar to keep it from leaning around corners. We have our lower control arm that controls the wheel, but we have added an upper control arm. The Mcpherson Strut type does not use an upper control arm, it just uses a lower control arm. So the big thing you need to know is the difference between steering components and suspension components. If you just remember this, steering components allow the wheels to turn side to side, and suspension components allow the wheels to go up and down as we go over bumps and dips in the road. When you take your state test at the end of the year, there'll be a list of components, and you have to decide, are they steering components or suspension components? We'll have a practice test on that a little later on this week, where you'll have to take the list and move them to steering and suspension. Now we're going to turn around and we're going to look at some actual components off of cars. This is a rack and pinion steering. As we turn, the steering wheel would be attached here. As we turn this, that moves the tie rods forward and back to steer the car. This is the shock absorber. Shock absorber does not absorb the shock of the road, but it controls the shock of the spring. If you did not have shock absorbers, your car would hit a bump and just keep on bouncing for another couple of blocks. This is the steering gear, the old school type steering gear. the steering wheel would attach here, and on the end of it would be a pitman arm like this. So as you turn the steering gear, you can see the pitman arm turns back and forth. Parallel with the pitman arm will be an idler arm. Looks pretty much just like it, but they'll have a link between the two. That's called a center link. And then from there, it will go over to the wheel with the tie rod. I don't have a tie rod off of this system out here. This is a coil spring. This is a spring you're probably most familiar with. You go over a bump or a dip, it squishes down, and it's going to spring back to its original shape to absorb the bump or shock in the road. This is another type of a spring. This is called a torsion bar. It is also spring steel, and it twists like this to give the spring. So if the tire was attached at my elbow, we went over a bump, it would twist on this bar like this. When we get done with the bump, it would go down like that. Here's the third type of spring. This is called a leaf spring. Leaf springs, mostly you're going to find them on the backs of trucks or older cars. It is spring steel, and they're stacked together, and it springs down like this as you go over a bump to absorb the shock of the road. Leaf springs are good heavy duty for trucks and stuff, but not that great for cars. This is a Mcpherson Strut. Mcpherson Strut is a shock absorber and a spring built into one, and also it eliminates the use of an upper control arm. So if you're looking at front suspension and it doesn't have an upper control arm, we're going to call that a Mcpherson Strut. This is the anti-roll bar or sway bar. It keeps both sides of the car at the same level or close to the same level, so you don't get a lot of leaning as you're going around corners. So the question for today's lesson is, which part of the steering and suspension system is actually part of both systems? It's part of the steering system and part of the suspension system. So to answer that question, look back through the video and find out which part allows the wheels to turn like this and also allows movement up and down like this. So if you go on the Google Classroom with your code I sent you in an email, and you click on assignments, I believe, there'll be an assignment called Day 1, and it's a one-question assignment, and all you have to do is a short one-word answer of what part of the steering or suspension system is actually part of both systems. So that's it for now. See you next time.